Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart is still an absolute technical highlight on PS5. Combining beautiful animation, fantastic modeling, and excellent lighting tech, including a pioneering implementation of RT reflections, the game is still one of the best-looking current-gen titles today. But in classic current-gen fashion, gamers had to compromise between multiple different modes, each with their own trade-offs in graphical features, performance, and image quality. Insomniac's brand new PS5 Pro patch aims to make that choice a lot simpler, giving players the combination of RT reflections, fine image detail, and 60 FPS performance on PS5 Pro consoles. So does this upgrade elevate Rift Apart a world apart from its base console counterpart? And how close does it come to matching the PS5's Fidelity mode? I think the most relevant point of comparison with PS5 Pro is going to be the PS5 version in its performance RT mode, because both offerings run at 60 FPS and feature excellent RT reflections. This mode on PS5 offered a 1440p-like image and probably offered the best overall experience on the base console. The biggest improvement here comes down to the way the final image resolves. The game is using PSSR on Pro, which is taking Ratchet from a typical internal resolution of about 1584p in my counts to a full 4K final image here, while the performance RT mode on PS5 uses a dynamic 1440p resolution and spends most of its time near or at 1440p. Both make use of DRS and use lower res post-processing, but that's about how the games appear to run on average. On fine bits of geometry, I think the difference can be pretty stark, with the Pro resolving clearer lines with more detail. The Performance RT mode featured a substantial passive post-process sharpening before, to give a greater perception of detail across the image. On PS5 Pro, we're getting better overall detail, but without the artificial-looking edge ringing and additional breakup often associated with sharpening. According to Insomniac core technology director Mike Fitzgerald, they found that the PSSR technique they're using on Pro resolved enough detail that they felt comfortable dropping the sharpening they had used previously. The RT reflections also resolve much more cleanly on the Pro console. These reflections had a grainy appearance on the base machine, with checkerboard-like patterns sometimes visible in reflective detail. PS5 Pro can look slightly softer than the base console here, but the RT resolve is more stable. There's also much less aliasing in areas like beveled edges on glossy surfaces, and on the borders of glossy materials in general. The most stark difference I see here is on this curved window surface, where the base console looks quite messy, and the Pro comparatively is much more coherent and less aliased. Mike did mention that the reflections resolve on PS5 should look softer and a bit more realistic, and that they've made changes to the noise and dithering patterns that feed into their RT reflections for Pro. One possible side effect of these updated reflections is that they tend to suffer from a bit more ghosting than their PS5 counterparts. This is obvious on this gadget, which has less RT aliasing on Pro, but the reflections tend to lag behind the movement of the object more obviously than on PS5. If we go back to that curved window, we see similar lag in the reflections when we pan the camera. RT lacks motion vectors, which temporal upscalers expect, so PSSR is given a pretty tough task here. The Pro emphasizes coherent reflections at rest with minimal aliasing, possibly at the cost of some more blurry reflections during movement. Clank in this shot exposes some of the benefits and weaknesses on Pro here, where the reflections on his curved head have less blockiness and aliasing, but also appear to lag a little when Ratchet sways back and forth. I do think the reflections overall look a good deal better on the Pro though. PS5 Pro is also doing a much better job at resolving particle effects. Look at the confetti here. On base PS5, the confetti particles fade in and out of existence as they move through the air, while on PS5 Pro, they appear much more coherent. This is another area where the lack of motion vectors creates somewhat subpar results with Insomniac Games' temporal injection technique, which was used on PS5. Other particle effects also appear smoother and less aliased on Pro, like the flare effect here. Foliage also generally looks quite a bit better on Pro. We get more foliage detail, especially at range. Close up it looks better too, though the difference is more minor. The higher frequency patterns of detail in the foliage before, I think, didn't interact all that favorably with image sharpening, so it tended to have a bit of an over-sharpened image on the base machine relative to Pro. Some of the distant trees here do look a bit less stable though, with a bit of noise that we don't get with IGTI on the base model. I also noticed that this grass has some temporal artifacts, perhaps as visual evidence of a kind of jittering process. When it comes to movement, I think the results are mostly positive. Complex animation, like the wrench swinging animation on Ratchet here, resolves with much less aliasing on Pro, producing a very clean result in comparison. Also notice how the image behind Ratchet coheres much more quickly on Pro, with aliasing in areas of disoccluded detail only visible briefly. Getting this to look good is a pretty tall order, given the fast animation with complex movement and constant occlusion and disocclusion, but PSSR is delivering a satisfying result. We also see very favorable results in the crowds here, where the clapping characters look quite clean, even with the footage slowed down. IGTI tends to have somewhat noisy disocclusion fizzle here, much like we might see with FSR, so the result on Pro is superior. But there are some areas where there's still a good amount of room for improvement on the Pro. This gadget reveals substantial aliasing across both consoles, and these distant towers have issues on the Pro as well. When we move through a scene, there's usually less aliasing on the Pro, though neither platform offers a perfectly stable result. The biggest difference definitely comes in scenes with prominent RT reflections, where the Pro is generally doing a much better job of keeping aliasing to a minimum. But notice how in that same scene, neither machine is really keeping geometric aliasing under control. In other shots, the Pro is definitely more temporally stable, though it can still struggle slightly with fine geometric elements. I also wanted to highlight fur rendering for a moment here. The Pro perhaps isn't quite as sharply defined as the base machine here, but the rendering of fur looks a bit more natural to my eyes, with less obvious dithering and a softer silhouette. It's more of a CG-like presentation than the fur had before, where it could look a little messy at times. But there is a curious issue in this cutscene, where Ratchet's fur now appears relatively dry, without the slicked back look it had before. Perhaps this is best chalked up to a bug in this build. Overall, I'm quite pleased with how Ratchet measures up on PS5 Pro in its Performance Pro mode. The image overall looks more natural, presents with less aliasing, and does a better job with trouble areas like reflections and fur. It's not a sea change in terms of clarity necessarily, but it's definitely a substantially better image on the whole. The PS5 Fidelity mode is bound to be a bit of a tougher challenge for the Pro to best. Boasting a 4K image resolve with IGTI, working from an internal resolution of a full 2160p or close to it, the Fidelity mode offered a very sharp and detailed image with RT reflections. The first thing that stands out is that the PS5 Fidelity mode is delivering a somewhat more detailed image than PS5 Pro here. Again, this is partly, though probably not entirely, a byproduct of reducing the level of image sharpening on PS5 Pro. The lack of sharpening on Pro does give the image more temporal consistency by minimizing local contrast though, which should help decrease apparent aliasing. Still, overall image stability takes a bit of a backseat to the Fidelity mode in these side-by-side comparisons. These towers alias quite a bit more than the Fidelity mode, for instance, as does distant detail in this shot. The Pro tends to have a slightly noisy, slightly unstable look in close-ups in comparison, straddling the Performance RT and Fidelity modes in that respect. But there are some definite advantages on Pro. Particles resolve substantially more coherently on Pro, with less breakup in the confetti here and on this flare. Reflections also tend to resolve more coherently on the Pro instills, though the detail level in Fidelity mode is substantially higher. In motion, the ray tracing can also look a bit more graceful in the Fidelity mode, with much sharper results. Certain types of movement don't fare quite as well with the Fidelity mode than PS5 Pro, namely the wrench swinging animation and the movement in the crowds, where the PS5 Fidelity mode is suffering from disocclusion issues. But while we're here, notice how the crowd density in the Performance Pro mode corresponds closely with the old Performance RT mode. I believe this PS5 Pro mode is using similar visual settings to the Performance RT mode, which means an occasional compromise here and there in settings like crowd density. In other areas, the Fidelity mode win is more straightforward. Foliage appears more detailed and more stable relative to Pro, for instance. Fur still has a slightly hard-edged look, but is a bit more temporally stable and more detailed. The Pro is doing a better job than the Performance RT mode in these areas, but the Fidelity mode simply has a lot more pixels to play with. To my eyes, the Fidelity mode is usually preferable to the PSSR infused Performance Pro mode in terms of image detail and stability, but I do feel like the PS5 Pro is preferable here overall, given its much higher frame rate and often comparable visual quality. It's close to a straight upgrade over the PS5 code, running in Performance RT mode, and that's a solid win for Sony's enhanced console. There is one other visual mode we should discuss, of course, though it feels a little vestigial at this point. The PS5 version offers a ray tracing free performance mode, which lacks the RT reflections in the other modes. This mode was dropped for last year's Spider-Man 2, but it is present in the other Insomniac PS5 titles. Relative to the Pro, image quality is more competitive here than in the Performance RT mode, as the IGTI technique is combined with higher resolutions, often around 1620p to 1800p. But the loss of RT reflections in Ratchet's glossy sci-fi environments renders it a less than ideal option, and I think that difference alone makes it kind of hard to compare it to the new Performance Pro mode. There is one detail that we still need to touch on, of course, and that's frame rate. The Performance Pro option targets 60 FPS, at least when running at 60Hz output without VRR, and it does a great job hitting that target. In the footage we have, the only time I saw the game drop frames was during its portal sequences, where the game does miss a few refreshes when transitioning between areas. Camera cuts during cutscenes also hold a frame for AA purposes, as we've seen in prior Insomniac efforts. Elsewhere, it's a straight 60. Overall, I'm generally pleased with the PS5 Pro upgrade we're seeing in Rift Apart. We're essentially getting the Performance RT mode, but with image quality that is more similar to the old Fidelity mode. Like other games with PSSR, the final image resolves differently than the game's old AA solution, but it looks competitive in a lot of respects, even if it tracks a little behind its high-res counterpart on the whole. Unlike a lot of other high-end PS5 titles though, Rift Apart already has pretty good image quality on base PS5 consoles, which probably minimizes the need for a PS5 Pro enhancement on some level. The Pro definitely looks substantially cleaner than its Performance RT counterpart, but it's not a situation like Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, where the base 60 FPS mode was just not up to par on a 4K display. I'm still very curious to see how PSSR fares in more demanding games though, games that are already in somewhat compromised form on consoles using FSR2. PSSR is working well in the games we've surveyed so far, but delivering a great 1440p or 4K image from a sub 1080p base resolution can be a challenge even for more mature AI upscalers. Higher end PS5 titles are pushing FSR2 to its limits, and it's here where PSSR really needs to deliver a big improvement. I'm also curious to see what Insomniac might do with a PS5 Pro Fidelity mode. Mike Fitzgerald from Insomniac hinted in an interview I conducted last month that a Fidelity mode with additional ray tracing could be in the cards for Pro owners. In theory, RT Shadows or RTAO, or both, could be harnessed for such a mode, with both options currently available in Rift Apart's PC version. Even if that mode does offer more ray tracing goodies though, I feel like it would take a lot to peel players away from the higher refresh performance mode that we've surveyed today. But for now, the range of Sony first-party and exclusive titles we've been sampled has fared quite well on PS5 Pro. That includes Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart, which offers a solid improvement over the base console experience at 60 FPS. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and press the bell for YouTube notifications. Check out the Patreon at digitalfoundry.net for exclusive and early access content and to get in touch use social media. Thanks for watching.